Hey y'all, this is Jacolia of Jacolia Gems. Thank you for once again coming back home, family. For those of you that happen to be new here, I definitely hope that you hear something today that will persuade you to stay. Now, with that being said, I believe I'm going to upload this video to TikTok as well. There's something going on with my phone, so I have a lot of articles and book clippings to read off of. I'm not completely up to sitting down to be back on camera yet. And when I come back on camera, I'm going to come back with the articles and the books that I have here in my persons for the sources. But the source material is always in the description on my YouTube, and those aren't ever all of the sources. I have papers and things that have been emailed to me from historians, from linguists, from archaeologists, and things of that nature as well. So, with that being said, let's get back into the Pequot Native Indians. We're going to make some correlations, and I do apologize for mispronouncing the names. The Wampanoag and the Nipmuc Indians. We're going to tie them into Ghana, to Nigeria Delta, to the Yoruba, and to the Igbo specifically. We're going to tie them in linguistically, and then we're going to also go into talking about the Pilgrims before they came over here, connecting my grandfather in King James, Elizabeth I, the holidays who helped found Virginia, Jamestown, because this goes into correlation with the Pilgrims who came in to found Massachusetts, Plymouth, Malcolm X, Native American chiefs, so on and so forth. So we're going to date back time to the early 1600s, and we're going to go back and remember about the fact that these people that were ruling were black. These were your free Negroes, your free mulattoes, and of course, there were Gentiles there as well. We have to even remember that just because they say Catholic, that does not mean mainly white. We need to know that Catholicism was from the pagans in those regions, and even the pagans that were in those regions, there was a great amount of Israelites amongst them as well. And I have so many books and things to prove that. When the Apostle Paul was writing, he was writing to Gentiles, but Israelites as well. So when he was writing to the Galatians and to the Goths and to the barbarians and to the Romans and to the, he wasn't just talking to Gentiles. So when all these nation of peoples came back in to West Africa, into Egypt, into Syria, into Lebanon, into all of these places, into South Africa, to subjugate the Israelites, other Israelites were Confederate amongst them. So when these people groups came in, you had your Israelites who remained as Israelites living autonomously. And this is where you will get your virus, your Goshen. We talked about this before. And so in the 1600s in England, in London, this is where you will get your Moorsfield. And this is where my grandfather, Mayor Leonard Holliday, would begin to come in. It was a swampland to the point where they built walls around it. It was an irrigation system like we begin to see in the Euphrates, where the high Beru began to come down, and where Abram was seen in the second millennial BC, the same as the high Beru, same as the statue of Yahweh. And we see that in Mooresville, they had a hospital. They had farmland. This was identical with my Irish ancestors as well. So we line these things up, and you mentioned, it's important for me to mention multiple and different timelines of these people so that we can prove a thing, because if it happens 3 times, it's a pattern, right? These are cultural markers. So in the 1600s, in the time of London, My grandfather Maryland a holiday, and the holidays were classified as mulattoes. Some of them were passing, but all of the holiday men that I see are chocolate. Now, I will say, when the holidays came into the United States, there are pictures of one of my passing grandmothers. She was classified as a mulatto before coming over here, then white, and then black. Not even mulatto anymore, but she was a passing woman. And so when the holidays came over here in the 1500s to 1600s, some of them, went into Virginia, and some of them came into Mississippi. The one that came into Mississippi, they married into the Choctaw Native American, who are known to be brown, ruddy, copper people. So that's possibly how the holiday men. But also, we have to remember that we can't get caught up on phenotypes, because my great-great-great-grandfather, Granddaddy Hugh, he was caramel like me. He was classified as mulatto. So we really have to think about the terminology and not always phenotype. Because when we look into the historical articles, these people, majority of them are described as being tawny, as being black, as being brown, as being dark. So when we look into the 1600s and we see that Queen Elizabeth and Catholicism, so we've already established that Israelites will become conversos. And we saw this happening in the Greco-Roman rule, but we saw this happening all the time. But when the Greeks came in the time of Antiochus, the Epiphanes IV, the Hasmonean dynasty, they was living autonomously, but then some of them converted. During that time also, the Israelites, the Jews, the Judeans, the Benjaminites, they were forcing Edomites, Arabs, Nabateans, Ishmaelites to become Israelites. So this is how all of these nations were conflated with one another. So conversos would begin to talk about those Israelites who was forced to convert to Catholicism. And some of these people pretended to be conversos, and they still practice Judaism, which is where you get your Torah cards. They had hidden practices of Judaism. And then this is where you will also get your Moriscos, because some of them were first to convert to Islam as well. So, where the Pilgrims come from, they were brownists. They were Calvinists, but they were not the same things as Puritans. When you look at the Puritans, the Pilgrims, they were separatists from the Catholic Church. They didn't want to have a formed church. They didn't want to be under the quote-unquote church fathers. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. Whereas the Puritans, they separated from the Catholic Church, but they still holded some tendencies to Catholicism. So that's the difference between the Pilgrims who came over on the Mayflower in the 1600s, who founded Jamestown. And when they got to Jamestown, Native Americans were there. There are articles that say by the time they got to Massachusetts that the Native Americans, the Wampanoag Native Americans, had died out due to disease, due to famine. And so when these Israelites came into this new land, they looked at it as holy land that was given to them. Why? Because they were fleeing religious persecution from the Church of England under Queen Elizabeth. We'll talk about her one day. Because remember, Queen Elizabeth, my grandfather, these people working together. My grandfather was an Israelite. So you gotta remember what was happening, y'all. So clearly, Granddaddy was wholly given over. We'll get into that. This is why it's important for us to know who we are, from whence we came, from what landmass we came, what tenets we were keeping. So the holidays were Freemasons. I've said this before. So these pilgrims, they were fleeing Elizabeth I when she was putting them out of England during this time. So when they got on this boat and they came here, it was their promised land. Case in point, when Christopher Colombo began to go and he began to look for the East. He was looking for Bahamas, the islands past Bahamas called what? Conception, Egg. He was looking for Eden. And we know that the Taino and the Arawak were in these islands. And you had your Carib and your Kalinango. And when the Igbo and the Akan began to come in, the Igbo say to the Taino Brim, meaning my people, my kindred, my kind. We've spoken about this. We've talked about how the Kalinango were the same as the Kikongo of West Africa, and how the Arawak were the same as the Arachu of the Igbo. And some people begin to think that it's a reach, but we're going to continue today to line these things up because we have to. Excuse me while I drink some water. I've been wanting to read articles, but I realize I retain a little more information than I give myself credit for. I just don't want to seem like I'm rambling because I literally be like re-seeing articles in my head sometimes, which is why I leave my sources in the comments. So when we began to look into Plymouth and these pilgrims coming into Massachusetts, Sephardic Jews and Moors fleeing religious persecutions. My grandfather, Mayor Leonard Holiday, one of the 111 liveries of London, who were merchants. He was one of the 14 founders or the directors of the London Company, who was the East Indian Company, who oversaw the Indian Ocean trade. So unfortunately, as I forestated, Mayor Leonard Holiday put blood on our hands by selling our ancestors into indentured servitude. Some may say he found them doing atrocities and paganism, and he was fulfilling the Deuteronomy 28. Some would say, well, how is this possible if he was a Freemason himself? And we know what Masonry goes back to. And this is why only the Most High can separate the wheat and the tare. We know he was part of the tribe of Dan. The tribe of Dan was prophesied to be a serpent. The tribe of Dan are also judges. So we see this played out again. Thank you, Holy Spirit. When we go to West Africa, and you have the priesthood of the Arachu, and they began to use the divination system of Urim and Thummim, and they sold off pagans, murderers, killers, kidnappers, witches, warlocks, to the British slave traders on the long Juju Road. They were executing judgment. The Indian Ocean slave trade was of cotton, of silk, olive oil, opium. So in the 1600s, when the Pilgrims and the Pequot Native Americans, when you began to look at the fact that the Pilgrims and the Puritans, they spoke and they used some English Pidgin words. And we began to look at the word Pidgin. Pidgin goes back into Piccadilly. which means child in West Africa. I don't want to get it wrong, so it's either, when I'm referring to West Africa in this video, I'm referring to the Yoruba, the Igbo, and Ghana, specifically. Nigeria Delta, but those specific. So when you begin to look at one of those languages, Pickaninny means child. Also in the Caribbean, when you look at the word Pickaninny, that's a derogatory term for a black child of African descent. When you look at Pidgin, it was spoken in the Caribbean. And what does this have to do with the Pequot Indians, the Wampanoag Indians, the Wampanoag Indians? Well, if you begin to look into history, when Malcolm X, why did he change his name? And why did he choose X? Malcolm X began to use a quote to say, "We're not Americans, we're Africans. We were taken from African. We were sold onto slave ships. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us." Because historians were stating that the Pilgrims were a new age to America. Well, biblically speaking, whenever the Israelites were fleeing from religious persecution and they went into a new land, the Most High would tell them, "I'm going to give you this land, and you're going to kill out the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Gittites, like the Jebusites, the Hivites, the Amorites, all of these Hamitic nations." And when we look into the Native Americans, they have all of these bloodlines in them, and some of them happen to have some Hebraic components amongst them. And the ones that happen to have the Hebraic components amongst them, some way, somehow, end up getting sold into indentured servitude. Now, Israelites weren't the only ones that were sold over in great number. Absolutely. You had specks of Neolithic people, specks of Cushite. Like specks of, and those people a lot of times got to go back home. Now, you did have some Israelites who were able to go back home as well. We'll talk about that as I get smarter. See, there are some things I'm not smart enough to even talk about, in my opinion. So when you begin to look at the Pequot, the Wampanoag, and the Wampanoag Native Americans, they were sold into chattel slavery for 7 times less the price of a West African. They went into chattel slavery into the Caribbeans, into the Azores, into England, and into Africa. And how do I know that they came back? Well, my grandfather was a Choctaw Native American chief. His paperwork had him in Mississippi, then England, then back over into Mississippi. He's a Choctaw Native American. So, when the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth, they indeed landed on these Native Americans who were sold into Africa. Or were they African first? You be the God. You be the judge. Because when you look into the Pidgin language and you break down the dialect in comparison to Jamaican Creole, in comparison to the Igbo, in comparison to the Yoruba, even some Hausa phrases, in comparison to the Akan, the Twi languages, they are mutually intelligible. And it honestly sounds like some of my broken languages, but if you know anything about the Southern vernacular, it is heavily broke. It's Creole. We continue to tell Black Americans that y'all may not know it, but some of y'all ancestors were West Indian. Some of your dialect and things that you have are West Indian. When I slip and I get very, very comfortable with the way that I speak, I didn't grow up learning Creole. I didn't grow up learning Pathos. When I slow those languages down and I hear somebody speaking in it, I understand it. And when I begin to say certain things, it come out the same. My mother, Willis side of the family, who were Creole and Choctaw Native American, they spoke completely different than my daddy's side of the family. Very fast, very choppy, very broken. They had the Creole factor amongst them, which will lead you back to the French, which will lead you back to some of these Puritans who were coming over from France. So when you begin to look at the Pidgin and it's identical into the Niger Delta, to the Yoruba, to the Igbo, to the Akan, and you will see that these people were sold into these indentured servitudes. And these people were on Plymouth Rock. Then when you think about Malcolm X, where did he get the idea to sign X? X was a marker that Indian chiefs used to sign documents to state that they were coerced to do so, not because they were illiterate. You have to remember that the mulatto, the ruling class, the Masons who started these slave trades, who were further removed from their culture, they would bring over the artisans, the Moors, the Hebrews, the black men, their brothers, as interpreters to the Native Americans. How would this be possible? Why? Because the Yoruba, the Akan, the Igbo language, which is identical to ancient Hebrew, was mutually intelligible with the Creoles and the Pathos and the Pidgin that was spoken in the Americas by the Native Americans. This all happened in the 1600s. Line upon line, precept on precept, here a little, there a little. This is Jacolia Gems. Bye.